Tarrabah. It's a gun. It is a gun. It's the only raid exotic that hasn't seen what I would consider any grand scale use. Legend of Acarius, while a bit tame compared to its glory days, still a powerful weapon. 1,000 Voices might not be at the top, but it's still a very strong choice. Anarchy, one of the best weapons in the game, period. And Divinity has incredible utility, along with Overload Champion stun potential. Tarrabah, while it has a very good perk, has never gotten any sort of significant attention. Today, I would like to venture into the world of Tarrabah. I realize I'm late to this party. Originally, this video started as a video talking about why I think Tarrabah should potentially not be buffed, and why I think Bungie is hesitant to buff it. We'll talk about those points in the video, but I've since changed my viewpoint after having some discussions and after playing with the weapon a bit more. We're going to talk about the gun itself first, but if you just want the discussion, skip to the time on screen. Tarrabah's perk is Ravenous Beast, where after you fill up a meter on the weapon, you can reload it in order to send it into complete hyperspeed for 8 seconds, with the potential to extend it for a longer duration. It takes about 50 shots to trigger Ravenous Beast, and it doesn't matter if it's a headshot or a body shot, you will get the same amount of energy. Not to mention that you'll also gain energy when damage is dealt to you. With Ravenous Beast, the gun deals damage equal to double the damage of a headshot, even on body shots. So headshot damage is 2x, and body shot damage is even more. On top of that, your rate of fire is doubled. And let's not forget about armor-piercing rounds, which are intrinsic on the weapon. So we're effectively looking at a 4x damage increase at worst for 8 seconds, which makes it the highest burst damage primary weapon in the game. The only thing that comes close is a maximum nanite outbreak perfected with the catalyst, but you need to build that up over a pretty long period of time. Rat King, fun fact, stacked to the maximum, it's pretty close too, but it's not close enough, and you do need a lot of other people in order to get there. The perk is one of the strongest bonuses in the game, next to stuff like the Trinity Ghoul Catalyst, Killing Tally, Master of Arms, and Honed Edge. Killing Tally has not been nerfed, neither has Trinity Ghoul Catalyst, but that's new. But Killing Tally has only been on one weapon, which is about to be retired. You can also sustain Ravenous Beast for a few magazines, provided you have reload speed mods and are hitting most, if not all, of your shots. For the time being, we're going to ignore some maybe more obvious reasons as to why the weapon has not been buffed. Maybe Bungie has not had the time to test potential buffs for the gun. That could be a reason. Perhaps they didn't want to buff the gun because it's going to be removed from the loot pool of the game until further notice, starting with Beyond Light in November. I can't imagine many people being happy about a gun that they can no longer get, potentially, being the new best gun in the game. So why don't people use Tarrabah, ignoring the fact that it's a rare gun? Why don't we find Tarrabah useful? Well, for starters, it came out during Recluse's main reign of terror. Recluse did what needed to be done with regards to an SMG, and that is kill low and mid-tier enemies really, really fast. Tarrabah, when it's not in its Ravenous Beast form, is just another SMG, whereas Recluse had no limiter on its power besides needing one kill. Master of Arms procced on everything. Tarrabah has a limiter, where not only do you need to build to maximum energy, you then need to reload again in order to get Ravenous Beast rolling. There's a lot more in the way before you get to the fun part. Once you do get to the fun part, then Tarrabah goes nuts. But also, for most content in the game, it's complete overkill. You don't need Ravenous Beast levels of damage to mow down low-tier enemies. And if you do fight high-tier enemies, well, that's what your special weapon is for, or your heavy weapon. You just swap to those guns. There's no build-up needed. Special Ammo Finisher all but ensures that your special ammo problems basically don't exist anymore if you happen to be in higher level content, making the appeal of getting to use primary ammo as your burst option not as much of a feature. So we have a gun that is currently outclassed by Recluse, even with its nerf when it comes to killing power for low and mid-tier enemies, and that can be replaced by special and power weapons when it comes to on-demand burst damage. I will clarify, though, that with Ravenous Beast up, Tarrabah's damage output rivals a lot of special and power weapons. I also played with Tarrabah in some Grandmaster content, since that's one of the few places where things actually hurt and don't instantly melt to weapons, although maybe I spoke too soon based on how the Lake of Shadows GM boss dies to swords in about 7 seconds. I figured that Ravenous Beast would melt Grandmaster champions with no issues at all. You stun them, you sit there for a little bit, a couple clips, boom, boom, you're done. And you know, it does all right, but definitely not to the level that I was hoping. It's good for one champion takedowns, but most things do just fine against one champion. See Ariana's Vow. There are much safer options when it comes down to taking multiple champions. You'll also rarely be soloing a champion, and if you are, it's likely because there are multiple champions alive and you're not focus firing with your team, and you probably won't be that close to the target if there are multiple champions alive in the first place. An SMG is a very risky selection in Grandmaster content when everything is killing you in a few shots and you need to be up close to deal good damage. Not only that, but because you can't stow, you're not allowed to use anything else for fear of losing your buff. You can't die, you can't even toggle ghost animations. For a GM Nightfall, that's asking a lot for an exotic primary weapon. This isn't a problem exclusive to Tarrabah though. Most of the time, close range weapons and GM Nightfalls don't tend to mix very well, with the exception of swords currently. But for all the extra work that you need to do, I just don't think the payout's really there. Also, if you are using Tarrabah, you don't get a champion mod, unless Bungie puts out a mod for anti-barrier SMG in your arms like they did with Season 11's Unstoppable Pulse mod, which means you need to rely on your teammates to do the anti-champion stuff, and if you do want to do anti-champion stuff, you need to run double primary. Also, not ideal. Should the entire gun's existence be balanced around GM content? No, but this is just an example of the gun's lack of power, maybe not power, but interest or potential based on where I think it would need to perform based on its limitations. In GM content, the perk, I would say, is not worth the risk, whereas in easier content, it's overkill for most things. It's a novelty. Combine all of this with the fact that a lot of legendary weapons are really good already for killing basic enemies, low and mid-tier enemies. Why use the exotic for such a gun? Recluse is shuffling out of rotation when Beyond Light launches, but you know what's not? Huckleberry, which one could argue has even more killing potential than Recluse, especially with the Catalyst. Now, I originally thought that buffing the gun, buffing Tarrabah, the way that everyone wants, could potentially result in the gun being too strong. That buff is, you keep your energy after stowing the weapon, meaning you could hold onto a Ravenous Beast proc for a certain amount of time, whether it be a few seconds or indefinitely. That's the #1 buff that I've seen in the community. After all, the loss of energy and the sacrifice you need to make to build to that insane damage moment is the limiter keeping the gun in check. Recluse had no limiter, and it went berserk. I also thought that Bungie potentially does not want to have these all-in-one weapons that perform multiple roles, something like Izanagi's Burden. Tarrabah could be both a burst weapon and a general primary weapon. Izanagi's Burden was nerfed, but is still pretty good as a regular sniper and a burst damage weapon. Then we have other buff-based weapons. Trinity Ghoul and Lumina are both guns that have buffs that stick around when you stow the weapon. Ace of Spades will lose its bonus on stow, potentially pointing to an inconsistency. I would definitely argue that Ravenous Beast is a much more potent buff than Trinity Ghoul or Lumina. Lumina not losing noble rounds makes sense because 1, it would make the gun much more prohibitive, and 2, the gun is just not that much of a game changer in the overall scope of the game. Trinity Ghoul's effect is quite strong, but if you don't have the catalyst, then losing the Chain Lightning buff would be too much of a loss if you switched weapons. I imagine it's tough to balance the weapon around having the catalyst versus not having it. I realize that the catalyst is quite common, but still. Then we have Ace of Spades, which is arguably an easier weapon to use, and I imagine had its perk changed more for PvP reasons than PvE. Memento Mori did not need a PvE nerf, whereas PvP, okay. Memento Mori goes away when you stow the weapon. 21% Delirium loses killing tally stacks when you swap weapons. It's a stronger version of Rampage. The main point of the perk is to keep the gun out to get a lot of kills, so I don't mind the stacks falling off on Delirium because that was by design. Symmetry is another weapon that retains its buff when you swap, but the entire design of the weapon is based on swapping modes, and having to worry about losing stacks after building them up for so long would be incredibly annoying on top of the mode swapping. Wave Splitter also retains its buff when you pick up an Orb of Light, but the buff only lasts for 5 seconds, so the issue there is making sure that you even use the buff in the first place. A lot of these weapons that store their buff likely don't have a great enough impact on the game to warrant removing the buff when swapping, or because removing the buff would be too cumbersome of an experience when using the weapon. Tarrabah is potentially on the side of being a little too cumbersome. It is certainly possible that Tarrabah is the way it is because of PvP as well, as there are methods of gaining energy that don't involve shooting the gun, but rather receiving damage. Being able to stow that charge and roam with something else might prove to be too powerful, although if you have Ravenous Beast, I would argue that you could probably just do whatever you want with it because you're gonna win that fight if you're in the proper range. Should Tarrabah be buffed then? Well, I'm gonna bring us full circle. It is entirely possible that Bungie did not want to risk buffing the weapon in a time where it is potentially going to be unobtainable for an unknown amount of time. I feel like if we were going to see a buff to Tarrabah itself and not the SMG archetype that it's in, we would have seen one by now, as it's been over a year since the gun's release. At this point, I'm definitely open to experimentation. I'm just afraid that what it would take to bring this gun to the forefront might end up making this gun very busted. There are tons of potential changes, energy being lost over time instead of instantly, being able to proc Ravenous Beast and having the damage scale based on how much energy it had, various damage value changes, the list goes on. But at this point in time, it might be a little too late for Tarrabah. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.